Hello friends, welcome to UPSC Logics and my name is Siddharth and today we are going to discuss the trade union movement. The Indian trade union movement lasted from 1875 to 1947 and this was related to the rights and the struggles of the labor class that were working in the factories and the plantations of the British and the Indian industrialists. So we are going to have a look at the trade union movement from 1875 to 1947, and the union movement has been divided into six stages. So we shall have a look at all those six stages as well as the commissions and acts that were made in regards to the betterment of the labor class in India. So let us begin this topic. Now let us have a look at the causes for rise and growth of the Indian trade union movements. And number one was that the Indian workers worked under intolerable working conditions in industries, factories, mines and plantations. Number two was that the industrialists, both Indian and foreign, as well as the colonial government were unwilling to improve the working conditions of the workers. Number three was the outbreak of World War I, and this produced a shortage of shipping facilities, and consequently, the imports to India were restricted. But there was a huge demand for the Indian goods from the allies as well as the neutral countries. So there was an unprecedented boom in the Indian trade and industry, and while the prices of essential commodities and services were increasing at an astronomical rate, the wages did not match up with the rising cost of living. So this made the workers to agitate. Number three was that a proper guidance and leadership was provided by some of the nationalist leaders who wanted to enlist the support of workers for their movement. Number four was that the Russian Revolution of 1917 took place and the establishment of USSR and a communist thought held out a prospect for new social order to the workers. Number six was the establishment of the International Labour Organization or the ILO in 1919 after the World War I, and it was established to protect and preserve the interest of the workers, and this helped in growth of labor associations in India. So now before we have a look at the first stage, let us have a look at the stages. And the stages of the movement can be divided into six stages. So the first stage lasted from 1875 to 1918, then the second stage was from 1918 to 24. The third stage lasted from 1924 to 1934. The fourth stage from 1935 to 39. The fifth stage from 1938 to 45, and the sixth stage was from 1945 till independence. So these are the six stages of the Indian trade union movement. Now let us have a look at the first stage that lasted from 1875 to 1918. And during this phase or the first stage, no trade unions were organized and no concrete steps were taken, except some enlightened leaders convened meetings to submit memorandums and representations before the government appointed commissions and committees. So there were two commissions that came during this time and two acts that were passed. So the first factory commission was appointed in Bombay in 1875 and the second factory commission was appointed in 1884. So let us have a look at the first Factory Commission Act of 1881 and what it had to say about the welfare of the labor class. So the conditions of the workers in 1875 was worse than slave labor. So the first Factory Commission was appointed in Bombay in 1875 and the first Factory Act was passed in 1881. So this particular first Factory Act gave some provisions, and number one was that no child below the age of 7 years should be employed in a factory, and those who were between 7 to 12 years were to work for only 9 hours a day, and they were not to operate any dangerous machinery or to be employed in two different factories on the same day. So this was to ensure that a child who was working for just 9 hours a day was not sent to some other factory to work for another 9 hours. Then number two was that there was a provision for 4 holidays a month and a break of 1 hour during a working day. Number three was that there was no restriction placed on the employment of adult labor, and provisions were just made to guard against the parts of machinery that could be dangerous if they were left unfenced and for reporting accidents. Number 4 was that the supervisors were to be appointed by provincial governments to ensure that this particular law was properly implemented. And number 5 was that the definition of the term factory was given. So, according to this particular act, the term factory was defined as any premises that was other than indigo tea coffee plantation wherein work was carried on for not less than 4 months a year, and this was done by the process of utilizing mechanical or steam power, and it employed not less than 100 persons. So the first Factory Commission Act of 1881, although wanted to improve the conditions of the Indian labor, but failed to do so because there was no inspection machinery in place. So laws were made, but nobody was there to check whether those laws were being enacted or not. Moreover, the exemption of tea, coffee, and indigo plantation from the term factory, a blatant example of racial discrimination as the British dominated tea, coffee, and indigo plantations, were left out of the coverage of this particular act. Now let us have a look at the second Factory Commission and Act. So another Factory Commission was appointed in 1884, and the first conference of workers under Mr. Lokhande was organized in Bombay that drew up a memorandum to be presented to the Factory Commission. So this was the beginning of trade unionism in India, and the memorandum included demands for a weekly rest, half an hour recess, compensation for disablement, payment of wages not later than 15th of every month, and limitation of working hours from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. But the Second Factory Act that came out in 1891 and was passed on the recommendation of the Second Factory Commission was another great disappointment because it provided only a few improvements like weekly holidays, fixation of working hours for only women and children, but the hours for work for men were still left unregulated. Now let us have a look at the second stage that lasted from 1918 to 24. And during the second stage, a good number of trade unions were organized. So the Madras Labour Union in 1918 was the first trade union of modern type in India. And the president of this particular trade union was Mr. B.P. Wadia, who was an active member of the Home Rule movement and took pains to develop it. So many unions were organized in other places. In 1920, the All India Trade Union Congress or the AITUC was organized at Bombay by N.M. Joshi and others. And 64 trade unions with a total membership of about 1,40,000 were affiliated to it. So in its first session in 1920, it was presided over by Lala Lajpat Rai, and the interest of the workers of different industries were looked after by the concerned unions. So the AITUC looked after the interest of the labor in general. So the rise of the trade unions was also accompanied by a large number of strikes, and the demand of the workers were to increase the wages, then bonus should be granted, there should be rice allowance, reduction of working hours, and extra holidays. Another important feature of the trade unionism in India during this period was the inability to make much headway in the well-established manufacturing industries like mining, textile, jute, etc. Now let us have a look at the third stage that lasted from 1924 to 34, and this particular stage saw the members of the Congress being unable to participate in the trade union activities. So this particular resolution was passed in Gaya session of 1922, and by 1925 the communist influence had become extremely strong. So there were two main leading leaders who were communist in nature, and these were Dundiraj Thengdi and S.V. Ghate. So they both were strongly oriented towards Moscow, while the other leaders such as N.M. Joshi, Diwan Chamanlal and V.V. Giri established close links with the Trade Union Congress and Labour Party in the UK. And in 1926, they were able to get the Trade Unions Act passed. So this act made provisions for voluntary registration and gave certain rights and privileges for registered trade unions in return of certain obligations. In 1928, the communists tried to take over the AITUC. So their candidate or the candidate for presidentship, who was B.D. Kulkarni, lost by a narrow margin to Jawaharlal Nehru. But this did not really affect the communists, and they called for the Bombay textile strike in 1928, and they registered a great victory in terms of their strike and their Mumbai Girni Kargar Union. So during this stage, the influence of the communist ideology was clearly seen at work, and communists had begun to infiltrate into the trade unions as early as 1925. So their infiltration had brought about the changes in patterns of the strike, and there was harsh and impolite language and brutal methods that were commonly used. Now the trade unions during this stage received a setback due to the ideological conflicts between the trade unionists and the radical elements with an intention to use the trade union movement to further their political motives, towed in line the fraternal political body at Moscow. On the contrary, the moderates in trade unions desired to keep the movement away from the communists, and consequently the struggle of capture and to strengthen their respective positions in the AITUC began to widen the gulf between the Congress and the communist followers. So the ideological differences led to the division of AITUC in 1929 when the moderate faction left it and formed a new organization called the Indian Trades Union Federation, and there was a further split that occurred in the AITUC, and a section was made under the influence of M.N. Roy and was called the Red Tuck. So all these developments occurred when the country was under the impact of Great Depression and the civil disobedience movement was going on. And towards the end of this period, attempts were made to forge the unity among the various trade unions, and these attempts were made by people like N.M. Joshi, R.R. Barclay, and this resulted in the foundation of National Trade Unions Federation or the NTUF in 1933. Now let us have a look at the Whitley Commission, and this was a commission on labor and is also known as the Royal Commission on Labor under the chairmanship of John Henry Whitley. It was set up in 1929 and the commission submitted its report in 1931, and it consisted of 11 members out of which 6 were Indians who were Srinivas S. Shastri, Ibrahim Rahimtullah, Kabiruddin Ahmad, G.D. Birla, N.M. Joshi and Dev Chaman Lal. So it was to inquire into the existing conditions of the labor in the industrial undertakings and the plantations that were existing in India. So let us now have a look at the recommendations that this particular commission made. And number one was to standardize the wages in Bombay cotton mills and the other jute industries. Number two was that in order to promote cordial relationship between management and employees, it suggested 3 steps. So number one was the development of a stable trade union. Number two was appointment of labor officers, and number three was the formation of work committees. It also recommended the appointment of a conciliation officer so that he could settle the disputes between the parties at an early stage. And the commission also dealt in some other subjects like transport services, public work contracts, fines and deductions, compensations, etc. So the results of this particular commission was that there was an appointment of a conciliation officers, as it was a provision that was made in the Trade Disputes Amendment Act of 1938, and none of the other recommendations were actually implemented. Now let us have a look at the fourth stage that lasted from 1935 to 39, and during this stage the union activities were revived once again, and there was an increase in strikes. So there were a number of reasons for the revival of the union activities during this period, and number one was that the Government of India Act 1935 was implemented and the Provincial Congress ministries had formed. So these particular ministries had adopted a policy of keeping the industrial peace, not by suppressing the labor organizations and denying their demands, but by prescribing a minimum standard of living and general rights of citizenship. Number two was that the Act of 1935 provided for election of labor representatives, and these were done through the labor and trade union constituencies. Number three was that there was a change in attitude of the employers as well, and it was suggested by the ILO that the employers should not be hostile but friendly towards the trade unions. And number four was that the unity move was also initiated that resulted in the merger of the Indian Trade Union Federation with the National Trade Union Federation and the merger of the Red Tuck with the AITUC. And finally, there was an affiliation between the NTUF with AITUC in 1938. Let us now have a look at the fifth stage that lasted from 1939 to 45, and the fifth stage corresponds to the war period again. So the World War II broke out, and this actually offered protection to the Indian industries. So the supply of the foreign goods was denied to the Indian markets mainly because there was a shortage of shipping facilities, and the peacetime industries in Great Britain and India had switched over to the war production. So as a result, the Indian industry stepped up their activity, and there was record production in India during this time. But the prices rose sharply and inflation prevailed, and there was a rapid increase in profits but not in wages. So there were strikes, but there were fewer strikes, and there was a decline in number of strikes mainly because number one, the communist leaders who supported the war did not favor strikes. Number two was that there were sections of the trade union that did not have the right type of leader to guide the movement or to formulate the grievances of the workers. Number three was that the attitude of the employers had also changed after the ILO, and they were no longer hostile. And number four was that the government of India under the Defense of India rules had assumed power to prevent strikes, and they would refer any dispute to arbitrate courts. So on the whole, the importance that was given to the trade unions had enhanced, and there was a permanent collaboration between the government representatives, the labor union leaders, and the employers. And then under the National Service Ordinance of 1940, the rights of workers was also protected. Under the Essential Services Maintenance Ordinance of 1941, there was a prohibition of employers from dismissing the workers without valid reasons. Now the sixth stage, that lasted from 1945 to 47, was marked with certain features. Number one was that there was a further growth in trade unionism. Number two was that the war had ended and there were no benefits for the workers at all except the cost of living had gone up significantly. Number three was that the political powers of the country had realized the importance of the trade unions, and instead of suppressing them, they had realized that these trade unions had a valuable role to play in the changed circumstances. So they passed the Trade Unions Act and amended it in 1947. And this secured compulsory recognition of trade unions by employers provided they fulfilled certain requirements. Number four feature was that there was an increase in number of women in the trade unions, and due to this their position in trade unions as well as society had enhanced. Number five was that a large number of smaller unions came to be organized, and these small and local unions could not carry out effective collective bargaining to ensure effective implementation of awards. So as we have seen that the local unions and the small trade unions, they did not have any bargaining power, and instead they were hampering the work that was going on, and the number of strikes increased. So these strikes increased in Bombay and West Bengal, and later on was followed by Madras and Uttar Pradesh. And the government of independent India was greatly worried because of this rising unrest in these four states, and they decided to call in for a industries truce conference that was attended by representatives of government workers and employees, and this led to the enactment of the Industrial Disputes Act of 1947 that provided for an appointment of conciliation machinery. So this machinery was supposed to help in sorting the disputes out between the workers and the mill owners. So friends, this brings us to the end of this video, and thank you so much for watching, and do like and subscribe to the channel if you are watching it for the first time, and don't forget to press the bell icon to get the latest notifications from UPSC Logics. So thank you so much, and Jai Hind.